Hello everyone. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to this special event entitled "What Breakthroughs in Science Can We Reasonably Predict?" For those who don't know me, I am James C. Barbieri, Associate Program Director at the PARI Center, and I'll be your host for today. We also have with us Eleanor Peat, who's the Program Director of the PARI Center, who will assist me and you during this call. Before we begin, I'd just like to give the Zoom rules for this call. During the presentation, we ask participants to turn off their microphone to ensure the better quality audio. For this reason, if we hear background noise, we may mute you, but this is not to silence anyone, it's just to ensure a good audio for everyone. If a participant would like to ask a question or make a contribution to the discussion, please use the raise your hand tool on Zoom, or otherwise physically raise your hand, and if I spot you, you can speak. And of course, we also always have the chat section open on the Zoom call, so feel free to use that. We also invite all participants to turn on your camera, as we believe it creates a nice educational environment, seeing everyone's faces and reactions. But of course, if you don't feel comfortable doing so, feel free to keep it off. All sessions are recorded for archival purposes, and these recordings will be available to all who have got a ticket or people who got a ticket but couldn't attend. And these recordings are meant for participants only. So if you do receive the link, please, if you could just not share it with people who are not participants. Now, let's begin with the session. Today, we welcome our guest speaker, Olival Freire Jr., who is a professor of physics and history of physics at the Universidade Federal de Bahia in Brazil. Olival has published several books and articles, such as the book David Bohm, A Life Dedicated to Understanding the Quantum World, published in 2019, and The Quantum Dissidents, Rebuilding the Foundations of Quantum Mechanics, published in 2015. The session will be structured with a presentation by Olival that will last around 40 minutes, and then we proceed to discussion, when we might do breakout rooms as well. And that's it from me. Over to you, Olival. Welcome.
Thank you very much, James. And thank you very much, Eleanor and Maureen, for the invitation. And thank you, everybody who is in the room this afternoon in Brazil, this evening in Italy, and the other times in other places. When I was approached by James and Eleanor with this suggestion, I was hesitant. I was not sure that I could fulfill their expectations for at least one main reason. I work with physics, and I work with history of science, history of physics. And my main research is with the history of science. And the historians, they are used to think about the past times. And James and Eleanor were asking me to think about the future. Then I was beyond my expertise. But the invitation was very challenging. And indeed, we do not have any kind of expertise on reflection about the future. So I'm not entering in a field where there are experts, and I'm not an expert. Indeed, we had in the past a kind of futurology as a kind of science of the future, but this did not lead to good results. Then, what I am suggesting today, it's not to work on a solid ground, as, for instance, in a few minutes, we were discussing about the atomic decay, and if this was a hidden variable or not, then we had a clear-cut answer. This may be related to hidden variables depending on the point of view of Einstein, Bohm, etc. Then we are not in this kind of more solid ground. We are in this session in a more conjectural ground. We are trying to guess the future of science, but we are not trying to guess anyway, just as our expectations. We are trying to do what I called informed guess. What I mean by this? It's based on our knowledge, on our current knowledge of science, and also a few hints, a few lessons from the history of science. Then, in a certain sense, we are discussing the future of science as we could be discussing the future of democracy, the future of the environmental issues, and things like that. We try to base our views in our common wisdom, in our knowledge from the past, but we are doing some guess, some conjectures about the future. The second reason I was a little afraid to accept the invitation is that because as historians of physics in particular, we know very well a very infamous case in the history of physics. It was 1900 when Lord Kelvin gave a speech, and he said something like, physics has no major problems in the future of physics, no major problem to be solved. There are only two small clouds in the physics horizons. And he explained these two horizons, these two small clouds, sorry. These two small clouds were two technical problems which were related later, a few years later, 10 years later, to the two major scientific revolutions in the 20th century physics, theory of relativity and quantum theory. Then I, as a physics teacher, I am familiarized to tell these histories in my classes. So I told this history many times in my class. When I began a course of relativity or of quantum mechanics, this may be kind of a hint to begin the course. Then I was a little afraid. Maybe I'm doing the same mistake Lord Kelvin did 120 years ago. But then I tried to be more humble, and I said to myself, you are not Lord Kelvin. Lord Kelvin was a great physicist. He did this mistake, but he was a great physicist. Then I decided to accept the invitation. That's the background of my decision to discuss this subject with you following this invitation from James and Eleanor. There is another limitation that I want to make clear to you. As I am speaking about informed guess, about informed conjecture, my own field as a physicist, as a historian of science, my own field is more related to engineer, physical science, mathematics, and so on. So I am less related from the point of view of the reflection with biomedical science, biological science. Then what I'm doing this afternoon, some bar may just criticize, saying, okay, but you are not trying to to see what is ahead in the biomedical science. The only thing I can say about biological science and biomedical science is that the last promise we had, the last huge promise we had in the last 30 years, it was about 1990, when the Human Genome Project promised to decodify the human genome, and then we would have a solution for every illness, human illness. And this project lasted 10 years. It was the result of two competing teams. It was a great result, but the main result, the main conceptual result, I would say that our expectations of having some kind of genetic determinism for every illness the humankind has, this kind of expectation vanish, because the human genome became clear that it is far more complex than the advocates, the defenders of the genetic determinism had thought. We have today a whole field called system biology, which tries to understand, not through this kind of oversimplification, each part of the genome, each illness, and system biology is part today of a huge effort to understand how the genetic heritage mix with other factors, including environmental factors, to have the results as we are today. So I say this just to say that my main guess today, I'm not making adventures in the field of biological and biomedical science. Okay, so what are my guesses and what I may say about this? I want to share with you on the screen. It's exactly what I want to. So I want to speak about 3 possible domains for breakthrough in science. And I wanted to speak in the end just a short note about what I'm calling a note of skepticism. I would say even a note of pessimism, because I cannot guess any advance on this 4th possible domain. As you see, I am far more optimistic when I speak about the first 3 possible domains than the 4th domain. And what are these domains? The first 3 domains are these 3. I will speak in detail about each one, but the first one is related to what we call quantum technologies. I am using technologies instead of information. The main field is quantum information, but I am using quantum technology because some of the applications are not exactly related to quantum information. For instance, in quantum metrology, quantum sensing. Then I took quantum technologies as an umbrella title for the first thing I think that we may have in the near future important breakthrough. And then I would say that we may have important breakthrough in 2 different senses. We may have technological breakthroughs because we have huge technological promise in quantum mechanics today, but we also may have a second breakthrough because bypass with the technological promise, we have now a number of scientists everywhere working on what I'm calling the rebuilding of quantum mechanics, which means to rebuild the foundations of this important physical theory, which is quantum mechanics. The second topic, I will just say a few words later, is quantum gravity. I know that quantum gravity is related to rebuilding of quantum mechanics, but quantum gravity nowadays is a subject in itself. It's enormously important to be considered a possible candidate for an important breakthrough. And the third field is cosmology. We may also connect cosmology with the study of quantum mechanics, saying that we need the quantum mechanics for the studies of some cosmological phenomena, for instance, black holes. But I want to single out cosmology in itself as a field where some new and interesting events may come in the near future. And my note of pessimism is related to the challenge related to the current pandemic. I don't want here, and I have no expertise here to discuss with you the health issues related to the current pandemic. But I want to discuss what the current pandemic may teach us about the kind of challenge we have ahead of us. So, after 9-10 months with this pandemic, what kind of lesson we may have from this experience? That's the fourth subject I want to talk today. Now, I'm not going to talk in a technical manner. I know that we have in the room a very diversified spectrum of people. We have good physicists in the room. We have people who are not trained in physics. Then I am trying to speak in the more non-technical manner. What are my expectations about these possible breakthroughs? So the first one, quantum technologies. What I'm trying to tell you. When we think about conceptual breakthrough, we always think about a theoretical breakthrough. We think about Newtonian mechanics, we think about heliocentrism, we think about evolution theory, quantum mechanics, relativity, etc. But we know that some technological advances have had an impact on our societies, that they changed, they had been able to dramatically change our societies. Steam power, electricity, the flights, the planes, the telecommunications, all of these are examples of this kind of technological or practical changes in society. I wanted to just recall you that about 60 years ago, 70 years ago, we had an important technical breakthrough, which was the invention of the transistor. You may have on the left, on black and white, this picture of the first transistor, and you may see 1-inch cube to compare the size of the transistor. The transistor is the quantum device for excellence. But see the size, 1-inch cube, it was the size of the transistor. And the transistor was a promise to replace this thing that the old guys, the old woman in this room knows well. For sure, James never had seen something like that, these electronic valves. But this was the base of the electronics throughout the 20th century till the 1960s and 1970s. And on the other side, we have this integrated circuit, which is and the integrated circuit is just an ensemble of a transistor, if I may summarize and simplify the idea. What I want to say with this, I want to emphasize the idea that from the engineering point of view, the electronic valve, the transistor, and the integrated circuits, they played the same role. But you may see that size, length, scale plays an important role here. And the more evidence of this important role is when you relate electronics, as we know, to computers. On the left, in black and white, this was the first and the great breakthrough in the mid-20th century. The computer, where it took a room to have a computer, and you needed a number of people not to feed the computer, just to replace the electronic valves, because these electronic valves, they were able to, they hit, and from time to time, they just burn out. And on the other side, you have a cell phone, a smartphone today, which is more powerful as a computer than this huge computer on the other side. Then the current expectations related to quantum technology is exactly to use quantum mechanics to build a different kind of computer, which means use the very laws of quantum mechanics, in particular what we call the principle of superposition, to build more speed computers. Where we are in this road? Many of you in this room have seen these two pictures where you have the two giants, Google and IBM, competing for these two for the construction of these two quantum computers. These quantum computers are very simple. They are able to make a kind of calculation that anybody may, with 2 or 3 lines, to make, for instance, factorize a number like 15, 17, 19, 21, to decide these kind of things. Then, as the quantum computers are now, they have no future. You cannot compare these quantum computers with a computer like this iPhone. But the problem is that these quantum computers should be compared to the current smartphone, or they should be compared to the previous and first computers in the history of the humankind. So they are just one step in a certain direction, or we cannot go ahead of this, example. Then this is the first promise. Now, why I didn't say the subject is quantum computers? Because indeed we have the use of quantum mechanics for building computers, the use of quantum mechanics to quantum cryptography. Some of you have seen the use of quantum mechanics for quantum cryptography in Europe, in Austria, in Switzerland, and nowadays in China. And we also have the use of quantum mechanics for quantum sensors, or what we call quantum metrology. So instead of speaking about the future gadgets that this revolution in quantum mechanics may bring, I wanted to show you just a number. It's a number, a figure, from an article in The Economist. It's a very important article because this article won a prize from the American Institute of Physics for popular science. So you may find this, it was published in The Economist, but you may find it now either in the site of The Economist or in the site of the American Institute of Physics. It's a very, very interesting paper for people who are not familiarized with this technical domain. But you may have some numbers. The idea is that no is more effort, and the numbers are for non-classified quantum technology research. So you may have that possible, the classified quantum technology research is double or triple or 4 times these numbers. Then the numbers are in this order of millions of euros. You may see Europe is playing a huge role, but strongly competing with the United States and China to get the control of these technologies which are promised by quantum mechanics. Then I would say that my first guess of a breakthrough came in this direction. We may have some important things, some important technological breakthrough in this direction in the near future. I would say that usually the humankind does not spend money where there is no expectation of good results. Now, however, it's not only the expectation of technological breakthrough. We also have an expectation. I would say that nowadays physicists have a reasonable expectation that we may have new foundations for quantum mechanics, a kind of rebuilding of the foundations of quantum mechanics. I don't want, this is the subject, I am a historian of this subject. My main task as historian is the historian of the research on foundations of quantum mechanics. That's the reason I don't want to spend much time, because if I begin to speak about this, I will not stop. And James warned me that I have X time to spend here. Okay. But I want to introduce the subject, just give an example. For physicists, Frank Laloux is just one of the 3 guys who wrote the most useful quantum mechanics textbook. Every physicist in this room have studied at some moment in their lives the quantum Gill and Laloux. These were the 3 French physicists who wrote the most important quantum mechanics textbook. Then Frank Laloux recently published in 2012, but indeed this was based on an article with the same title a little before. I wanted to call your attention first to the title, do we really understand quantum mechanics? And this part of the introduction. If you may read here, you may have this idea. We have a rare situation in the history of science. Consensus exists concerning a systematic approach to physical phenomena involving calculation methods having an extraordinary predictive power. Nevertheless, almost a century after the introduction of these methods, the same consensus is far from being reached concerning the interpretation of the theory and its foundation. This is reminiscent of the colossus with feet of clay. I like very much this analogy. Quantum mechanics is a colossus with feet of clay. What I want to tell a little bit about this. This lack of consensus is contemporary of quantum mechanics itself. Before the discussion here, Sean spoke about Einstein, about David Bohm. We know that the number of great physicists who criticized the foundations of quantum mechanics, the first were exactly Einstein, Schrödinger, Lee de Broglie, and others. Now, what is different today is that there is a huge number of physicists who realize that we need a new foundational structure for quantum mechanics. And we have now a number of different attempts to build these foundations. Some of these attempts are far from the Einstein expectations. Somebody here in the room spoke about non-locality, but non-locality exists, and Einstein did not like non-locality. So some of these rebuilding of foundations of quantum mechanics are not exactly in the same lines as Schrödinger, as Einstein. And I would say even they are not exactly in the same line, for instance, as David Bohm worked for more than 40 years in his life. I would say that nowadays we have a plethora of a number of different attempts. Some are related to these previous attempts, for instance, Bohmian mechanics. For instance, the many-word interpretation is in line with the Hugh-Everett interpretation. And the others are based on some other ideas. For instance, the idea of information. There are a huge and an important number of physicists who are nowadays trying to rebuild quantum mechanics, taking the concept of foundations to put on the basis, on the foundations of quantum mechanics. And some of them would say that they are in line with Niels Bohr's idea. I don't want here to settle this dispute. What I want to convey, to introduce here is the idea that we may be, it's my impression, we may be in a situation where the rebuilding of the foundations of a physical theory may lead to a different physical theory. I have a number of examples in the history of physics. I may just cite one of these. We know well thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is one of the more powerful physical theories. Thermodynamics was set as a microscopic theory dealing with variables, physical variables like volume, pressure, etc. And it was built in the mid-19th century. From thermodynamics and related to thermodynamics, the kinetic theory of gases evolved to what we call classical statistical mechanics. Nowadays, statistical mechanics is larger than the previous attempt to map thermodynamics in a microscopic theory of atoms and molecules. Statistical mechanics is nowadays the basis for a number of different phenomena. For instance, when you are studying chaotic systems, when you are studying complex systems, complexity, for instance, you need to have the study of statistical mechanics. Then what I am trying to say, and move to a different subject, is that we may have an evolution where not exactly quantum mechanics exhibits its limitations. Not exactly there is a huge experiment which corroborates or not corroborates quantum mechanics. We may have a kind of a different foundational structure of quantum mechanics, and this different foundational structure may lead us to a different or a wider comprehension of the physical world. Now I jump to the different subject, the second domain, and I will be very rapid. And I will connect with the previous subject. The previous subject, one of the concerns related to the foundation of quantum mechanics is that quantum mechanics is impossible to combine in a consistent manner quantum mechanics with the theory of gravity, or in other words, with general relativity, which means that the two more important physical theories of the 20th century, relativity, gravity, and quantum theory, could not talk to each other. This lasted since the beginning of the quantum mechanics, 1927, 28, 1930, some physicists were already dealing with this subject, how to combine one or each other. Then time went by, and nowadays I can say 2 or 3 words about this problem. The first, you probably know that physicists use to say that we have a few foundational forces in nature. Electromagnetic force, nuclear force, weak force, and gravitation or gravity force. We can say that nowadays the problem is that the first 3 ones, electromagnetic theory, weak force, electromagnetic force, and the nuclear force may be dealt by quantum mechanics, while gravity cannot be dealt by quantum mechanics. I don't go into details what are the difficulties. I beg you accept this as granted that from the conceptual point of view, we cannot combine we cannot, with current quantum mechanics and current gravity, we cannot quantize, which means treat through quantum mechanics, the gravity force. And I would say that since 1970s, there was a surge in this research, and nowadays, almost 50 years later, we have nowadays 2 consolidated trends. In each one, we have different branches, but these consolidated trends are competing for solving this problem. Solving this problem means to get a quantum gravity. And no doubt that a quantum gravity would enlighten both gravity and quantum mechanics. So the first branch, the first trend, sorry, is string theory. Many of you know string theory by this title that journalists use to say theories of everything. String theory nowadays, just for give you an idea that how revolutionary string theory may be if in the future of science it became a standard theory. String theory does not deal with the idea of a singular point in space-time, but more than this, string theory deals with a space-time with, for instance, 11, 12, 13 dimensions. So if you are not comfortable with the Einstein space-times, 4 dimensions, 3 dimensions for space, 1 dimension for time, and if you are not comfortable with this Einstein idea that the space-time may be deformed by the presence of masses, then you are going to be still more uncomfortable with the string theories because we cannot have any idea about what is an universe with 11, 12, or 13 dimensions. The other theory, loop gravity, apparently is more conservative than the string theories. Apparently because loop gravity has no expectations of being a theory of everything. They have they have the expectation to quantize the space-time. The problem is that the price to be paid to quantize the space-time seems to be too high. Not only because we are entering in a field that Einstein himself would have an enormous difficulty to think about, is the idea that we do not have continuous space-time. We have a discrete space-time, but this is not the worst problem. The worst problem is that some of the authors, for instance, Carlo Rovelli, an Italian physicist who works with loop gravity, his main proposal is that we should kill the time. The time is a kind of a subjective interpretation. It should be abandoned as a physical variable. This idea of Newtonian time as somebody who flows, or even this Einsteinian idea that this flow of time may be changed due to the speed of the reference frames or due to the presence of masses, this should be abandoned. What should be abandoned? The very concept of time. So no more words to say about how important may be if in the near future quantum gravity became part of the physics or scientists toolkit. Nowadays, it's part of the research. It's not part of the solid toolkit in the hands of scientists. The third strand, I don't want to speak too much because if I begin to speak about this third one, the subject is vast. But I want to say that in the last 20, 30 years, we have an explosion of research related to astrophysics and cosmology. If you check the Physics Nobel Prize in the last years, you may see the last year, Penrose is one of the Nobel Prize. A few years ago, it was gravitational waves and so on. But so these advances are the result. They are the results of the development of telescopes. We are no longer speaking about telescopes based on Earth. Nowadays, the most important telescopes are based on the Earth orbits. And nowadays, cosmology strongly depends on astrophysics. Now, what seems to be the interrogations in the future of cosmology is that cosmology nowadays deals with concepts that we do not know most. We do not know almost anything about these issues. We just know that we have problems there. And the words you know well, dark matter and dark energy, are the two concepts that indeed what physicists are saying is that in our cosmological models, we have a lack of matter and a lack of energy. Something is not fitting. The empirical data are not fitting our models of the universe as a whole. What kind of evolution we will have here, I do not know, but no doubt we may have a strong breakthrough in this field. I just say this for you. In the last 4 centuries, the Western civilization, and indeed the whole civilization, we had a strong conceptual breakthrough related not exactly to cosmology, but related to what I could say a kind of pre-cosmology, because Copernicus and the heliocentrism was not exactly cosmology in the sense that we speak today, but it was a dramatic shift related to our view about the place of our world, the place of Earth in the universe. The Copernican revolution was a revolution in a well-grounded cosmological models, geocentrism, on which the astronomy, at least the Western astronomy, was based for more than 1,000 years. So this was the 16th century and the Copernican revolution. You may have an idea about the impact of this. We may speak the impact, if I speak about the role of Galileo, Kepler, Giordano Bruno, and the others, I'm not speaking only about Italians or German people. I am speaking about people whose ideas had an enormous impact in the history of civilization. Then in the beginning of the 20th century, we had this phenomenon, less known, but I would say probably so important as the first one. It was the multiplication of the number of galaxies in the early 20th century. By around the 1920s, there was among astronomers, American astronomers, what they called at the time the Great Debate. It was a debate about the size of the universe and the number of galaxies. Nowadays, if I am not wrong, the NASA makes an estimation that we have something about 200 billions of galaxies in the universe. So, still about history, why I called Copernicus pre-history of cosmology. Because cosmology indeed became a branch of science after the general relativity in the early 20th century with the works of Einstein. Einstein introduced the idea of a universe in expansion. And later, the idea of black holes were introduced as a singular points in the space-time where there was such concentration of mass that nobody could escape from black holes. We had a strong research about black holes. The picture of the year, last year, it was exactly a picture, not exactly a picture, a computer-produced picture of a black hole. And this is the history of cosmology. With these 4 or 5 hints, you may have the impact of cosmology in our times. Now, you may imagine what may be ahead of us if we arrive to understand what is dark matter and dark energy in cosmology. Finally, the current pandemics. I don't want to speak any details about the health problems related to the pandemic. I just brought here for illustration this kind of number I got today from the WHO. We have almost 2 million deaths this moment in the world about derived from the COVID-19. and we had 19 million confirmed cases. And we know that the number of confirmed cases is a clear underestimation, while the number of deaths is more close to the reality. What I want to suggest to you is that in addition to the huge challenge we are having at this moment about how to get vaccines, how to get people vaccinated, in which time, in which schedule, this is the main discussion everywhere. In my own country nowadays, this is a terrible situation because we have a federal government who denied the seriousness, the reality of pandemic. But even in countries who dealt well with this situation, we have problems today. If you follow what is happening in Europe, possibly we do not have enough vaccine in the scheduled time to get a rapid vaccination. What I want to suggest here is just a small reflection. We may be very influenced, and it's reasonable that we are very influenced by the human tragedy related to the COVID-19. But pandemics were and are not a new thing in the history of humankind. This is just a small impression. Justinian, 16th century, an estimate about 25 million of deaths. Black Death in the 14th century in Europe, an estimated number of 50 million, or 1/4 of the population. 19th century, the modern plague, still endemic in some areas. But what I want to suggest, it's not a history of plagues. What I want to suggest is that plagues like the past plagues, like the current coronavirus pandemics, are related to a problem related to the movement of humankind, the movement of species around the globe. In a certain sense, I would say that this is, in a certain sense, or up to a certain extent, inevitable. As inevitable as when the first Africans left Africa, the first Homo sapiens left Africa for other times. As inevitable as the first Polynesians tried to reach the Pacific coast. As inevitable as the first big navigations when Columbus was able to cross the Atlantic. What I'm trying to say is that this exchange of goods, these exchanges of people from a moment to another, this exchange of money, capital, from one side to the other side of the globe, and nowadays I would add the exchange of information, it was not by chance that in the world of information, the world of information in the internet, in the web, the first, the term, the word which was used to identify this kind of problem that we have with computers, the word was virus. So it was, the name was borrowed from the human experience. What I'm trying to say is that it's true. We cannot, I hesitate to speak because I do not have a clear answer or a clear direction of answer. And even I do not have an expectation that we can reach an answer in the near future. But I have a clear idea of the problem. what is the problem? And with the enunciation of the problem, I can conclude my talk. The enunciation of the problem is that exchanges are inevitable. We live in a connected world, um, far more connected as the past world. And this connection and this exchange between humankind and the nature, humankind is part of the nature, but the part of nature, but this kind of exchange, this is this has been inevitable, but this may bring huge problems as this kind of problem. A bacteria, a virus, who jumps from one ecological niche to another ecological niche as a human being, may bring in the world we are living this kind of crisis as the COVID pandemic. This is not unrelated to the kind of occupation of Earth. This is not unrelated to the kind of relation with nature we have. Then, what are the huge challenges, in my view? We need to have better ideas. We need to have clear ideas about how the human species may occupy the Earth, which is the only planet we know that we are able to live. It would be a very utopian way to think with Elon Musk and the other, okay, let's go to Mars, etc. How to live in a sustainable manner in this planet with less impact of nature and in a more socially just or in a more social, equal world. This common destiny, this common fate of the human species, I think that that's the problem that we had. The COVID pandemic brought to the fore of our discussions. What kind of future we can hope, we can think about the human species in this planet? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Oliver, for that. That was a very insightful presentation, and I did thoroughly enjoy that. So thank you so much, Oliver, for that. I guess now we can all move to breakaway rooms. Oliver, did you have any question that the breakaway rooms could discuss?
I have 2 or 3 questions, but we do not have enough time to discuss all the questions. So the first question I want to suggest is that anybody thinks about other possible breakthrough in the next future, in the near future, other scientific breakthrough, then this one that I had guessed. The second question, some ideas about how to live in a peaceful and sustainable manner in this planet. This is the second question. And the third question, we do not have time, but if you have specific comments about any of the subjects I suggested, just speak and we may discuss later about these subjects, this fourth subject I had suggested.
Okay, great, fantastic. I've just put those questions down on in the chat room, and so yes, you should all receive a invitation to join the breakaway rooms now-ish. If you want to sit out the breakaway rooms, of course, you can always stay in the main room until everyone comes back. Should we say about 20 minutes in the breakout rooms, Oliver? Are you happy with that?
Excellent. Excellent.
And then we can leave the rest for Q&A and discussion.
Excellent.
All right then. I will see you all very soon. Enjoy. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you've had interesting discussions in your breakaway rooms. Would anyone like to share what they've discussed, or would like to ask a question to Oliver? To ask a question, again, use the raise your hand function on Zoom, or physically raise your hand. Alison, welcome. Oh, you're still muted.
Hi, James. Hi. Thank you. That's been such a stimulating event, and we had a really interesting. In fact, we overflowed our 20 minutes in my group. We had a really interesting discussion around breakthroughs in AI forthcoming. Obviously, you know, building off what we already know about in terms of algorithms and Facebook and Google, and where that would be leading in the future. And we talked particularly around connections to, or I spoke about connections to AI and creativity, and how much that was founded on something possible and where it reached its limits. And we talked too about just the notion of intelligence and consciousness, I suppose, being something that might be not generated within, but something surrounding us that we pick up on as information, or as what Ferdinand and our group referred to as resonance. So we had, I suppose, discussions. Do feel free to come in, others, and add to what I'm saying, but particularly around AI and its surprising qualities, its potentially very dark qualities, but the fact that it's an unstoppable kind of train coming our way.
Thank you, Alison, for that. Oliver, do you have anything to say about AI?
Not so much, because it's my limitation of expertise. I have hinted that AI maybe for sure it's a different candidate for a strong breakthrough in the near future. But a breakthrough which is a mix of technological breakthrough, but also a societal breakthrough. But still, we need a conceptual breakthrough to understand what AI are suggesting for us ahead. Very recently, I was interviewed by somebody from the BBC about the bomb, and the journalist wanted an analogy for the implicate order. And the only idea which came immediately to my mind, it was exactly the idea of the web, the internet, and the AI as a kind of implicate order. Then, no doubt, this is one of the roads I did not exploit in my talks. I totally agree with you, Alison.
It's impossible, isn't it? There's so much to cover, and we leapt off from Bohm partly, and his notion of the part containing the whole. And then onto kind of webs of information, I suppose, is how our line of thinking went. But around different forms of intelligence, we talked about plant intelligence and webs of plant intelligence, and about intelligence not being necessarily, more and more is opening up, being only brain-centered. So anyway, we were quite wide-ranging in 20 minutes. But thank you very much. Thank you, Oliver.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Alison. I think, yes, Mike has his hand up. Would you like to come in? Oh, you're just still muted.
There.
There we go.
You can regret saying that later, James. I just want to make one comment in relation to the last speaker, and that is Elon Musk's comment that in terms of AI, he recognizes its dangers probably more than most of us, but he said what we must do is to assure that it supports human freedom. And that's something to bear in mind. Whether that's possible or not is another question. Having said that, I'll move on to our group and just share with you. I think what we, in terms of eminent breakthrough, we looked technologically and thought that the recent Chinese announcement vis-a-vis fusion, and your grandfather did a book on cold fusion, if you'll recall. And also the project at ITER, just outside, or at Cadarache, just outside Nice in France, they look to be heating up. And we would suspect maybe within the next 5 years, we'll see a sustainable fusion reaction. And that has very profound implications for the whole question of clean energy, which means profound implications for the sustainability of life itself, actually. And we sort of discussed that. Then we wound up discussing children. Speaking of the whole, or we being the parts in that whole, and looking at how we approach and the kind of reculturalization of our approach to children in terms of bringing up a more holistic and aware generation, and our final discussion, a very moving one, I would add, was about children and basically about how to love them, and by doing so, very much like fusion, producing a sustainable, holistic, joyous human future.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Just to clarify, when you talk about children, do you mean under like an educational point of view? Is it more of like sort of parenting, or?
We began by a quotation which was given to me by a hard-nosed lawyer. We're having coffee one time, and she said to me, "There's a divine energy that comes in with every child." And I'll be polite and say, she said, and we screw it up. And what we talked about was how not to do that.
Good.
Oh, great. Oliver, did you have anything to say, or should we move on to the next group?
May I make a comment? Because I liked very much Mike's comment, and I have an obligation to explain why I didn't talk about nuclear fusion when in the recent weeks we are under the impact of this Chinese announcement and also a British announcement. It was a kind of a bias I needed to avoid, a bias of myself, because I was raised as a physicist since the early 70s, when I began a physics student in 1972. Every year we expected to control the nuclear fusion. So this was 50 years ago. And I became very involved in how this was part of the dispute among physicists. Why so much money to nuclear fusion? But this is a bias. I have no doubt that a source of clean and important source of energy may be a very important breakthrough we are discussing. And then, thank you very much, Mike. And I did not include it due to this kind of bias I accumulated during my education as a physicist. I became distrustful towards nuclear fusion. And nowadays, we say in Portuguese, eu queimei minha língua. There are some people who speak Portuguese in the room. I burn out my tongue. That because
I understand.
They work in the near future.
We'll see what happens. Yeah. But it's better than it was 2 or 3 years ago when I was involved in that, which had to do with discoveries on the nature of the photosphere of the sun, where there was fusion, which they didn't expect, and the attempt to replicate that in some electrical fashion or something like this. But it's I think when the spiritual conditions are right, that'll happen. If we continue to be barbaric with respect to the rest of life, we may be the first to go.
Thank you for that, Mike. Gary, you have your virtual hand up.
Yeah. So our group talked a little bit about the possibility that relation is primal, right? That relation is, and consciousness is of the essence, and that physicality emerges out of that. And there are some people beginning to talk that way. There's a cognitive scientist by the name of Donald Hoffman, who's written a book called The Case Against Reality. And then there's a physicist by the name of Nima Arkani Hamed, who has recently shown, and this is a legitimate guy. He's at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, has shown that you can predict the scattering amplitudes from high energy collisions of particles in a collider based on a relatively simple structure, geometric structure. And so the question is, is reality very different from what we assume it is? And might it be qualitative rather than quantitative? Might it be, in the shape of shape rather than, in the measurement of size? And that there's a distinction between quantum reality, that is potentiality, and physical actuality, which is what we sense as physical beings. But that, as Donald Hoffman says, we've evolved a physical interface to allow us to survive as embodied creatures, but that at our core, we are relational beings. That has a really interesting implication for our behavior, because what it means is that the other precedes us. That if we don't take care of the other, then we don't survive. Right? And I think we've been programmed since Descartes, and the kind of the idea of physicality overriding relationship. We've been programmed that it's I take care of myself. And I'm concerned about putting too much emphasis on the need for freedom, because that needs to be balanced by an emphasis on responsibility. And if we don't see that responsibility, that the purpose of freedom is so that we can be responsible for each other's welfare, that we need to coexist before we can exist. then, you know, we're doomed, right? I mean, if we continue on this path of physicality overriding relationality.
Gary, have you written on this?
I'm writing a paper right now. The paper is for a psychoanalytic journal.
Which?
It's called Psychoanalytic Dialogues.
Could you send me a citation, or can I get it? Or?
Oh, it's not finished yet. The paper's not finished yet.
But it will be.
It will be. Yes, I definitely. Okay, I can do that. I mean, I've got my outline. I haven't finished the paper.
Well, thank you for that, Gary. Yeah. And please do send us the paper as soon as it's finished. Oliver, did you have anything to comment on that? Or myself?
I participated in the session where Gary was, so I have no additional comments.
Okay. I see Ferdinand may have a comment on that. He's got his hand raised.
I wanted to say something, with what Gary had mentioned, and something that earlier Allison had talked about with in respect to animal plant communication. There's a woman in by the last name of Samard who grew up in BC, and she is she grew up in a forest, in a BC forest, and she did with her grandfather going through that forest, an old growth forest, and later on she did her master's degree in biology, and she wrote a paper that was published in Nature magazine about '96, I think it was. It was called the Wood Wide Web, and one of the things that she discovered was that, and this challenges the Darwinian notion of survival of the fittest, competition of the species, and she discovered through that plant. One species of tree, I think it's the aspen and the Douglas fir, that instead of competing against the other species, there's also cooperation. There's an altruism between the aspen and the Douglas fir. So at one point, the Douglas fir transmits underneath the rhizomes through underground. At one point in the year, the one tree transfers food to the other tree, and this is a different species between two different species. And at another time of the year, there's a reciprocal process going beyond between these trees. Now this puts Darwin's notion of competition, or it challenges Darwin's notion of competition. She had she was originally, she had a lot of an uphill battle against, on the one hand, a male-dominated science, and on the other hand, her provocative thesis was challenged, but she did get published back in, I think it was '96. So that sort of relates to what Gary was talking about. We got to help each other, and we've learned that monocultural forests, like monocultural agriculture, has its problems, and what we end up doing is throwing pesticides on it, and it just that disrupts the biological ecosystem.
Thank you for that. I see a few hands raised. I don't know if would anyone like to continue or comment on what has just been said?
Yeah, would. May I?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I would just say that, a way of looking at that issue from a Darwinian point of view is to say that the Darwinian imperative is evolving. I think even Dawkins is recognizing this in terms of altruism, compassion, and so on. And this gives the example that you just gave is a very good biological basis, I think, for bringing that idea forward. The other point that I would make is in relation to the relationship between freedom and responsibility, which is a very important one right now in terms of how we deal with COVID. What we see is a kind of bifurcation of people who claim to be glorious and free and not wear masks and all of that kind of thing, vis-a-vis those who are showing some social responsibility and saying, okay, we'll do social distancing and masks. The difficulty there is with these, glorious and free people, is that they are endowing the virus with the qualities of freedom and allowing the virus to have free sway within societies, being caddied by death in that respect. And so it's a self-defeating social strategy that they're engaged in, while at the same time believing that they're furthering freedom. They are in fact furthering this disease. They are in fact furthering the death rates in any state like Sweden, or in any 2 states like the Dakotas, where we have 58% testing COVID positive, and she still isn't changing her view that this constitutes freedom. So I just wanted to add and emphasize that distinction is very important in terms of how we deal with the pandemic.
Thank you, Mike. Oliver, feel free to jump in when you want. Alison, you had something to add as well?
Thanks, James. Yeah, it was really just to add to Ferdinand's, just his earlier comment about the study, or the woman who'd grown up in BC, in British Columbia. And that was, I looked up the book that, James, you might have come across it in the UK, that really generated a lot of discussion, was the hidden life of trees, which really takes and explores a lot of these ideas around non-neural, non-brain intelligence. And also really recently, and I've heard him speak, and we have just friends in common, and he will, I think through David, through your granddad, James, will have been connected to David. He's Rupert Sheldrake's son, and it's, do you know Merlin? He's brilliant.
I don't know him personally, but I've heard of him, yeah.
We should get him for Pari. It's the Entangled Life, which is about the amazing intelligence of fungi. Oh, you've got it as well, exactly. Alan's got it. So the hidden life of trees, and I mean, I know we're diverging off today's topic, but at some level things relate. So that was just to come in with a couple of titles, really picking up on Ferdinand's point. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alison. So the next question, I think it was Peter had his hand up before. Is that right?
Yes, it was. Yeah, I just like to comment on this question of freedom, which has been raised. I think this is such an important subject for the future, in particular freedom of speech, because as we've seen very recently in the US, that freedom of speech by Mr. T, who believes he can say anything on Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of it. This is really, for the future, I think, a very, very important subject. What constitutes freedom of speech, and when is social media, all the different forms of social media, when are they going to be regulated? Because I think, in my opinion, something has to be done about regulation. You just cannot have people crying fire, 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 and the fire engines come out, and it just can't go on like this. And I think that is a very, very critical thing. In association with that, or it comes together with that, when we talk about artificial intelligence, as we discussed in our group, Ferdinand pointed out that Intelligence is probably not the right word. What it is an amassing of information which is out there through social media, through Google, through Facebook, and all the rest of it. Collection of information which can be used to, let's say, to further artificial intelligence, if you want. It's difficult to explain, but the two things, I think, the freedom of speech and the amount of information which is out there, which can be used for nefarious purposes, that is a great problem, I think.
Thank you for that, Peter. Actually, I find it quite interesting how, we're all talking about, we originally started talking about scientific breakthroughs, what could be great for the future. And somehow, which is good, I'm not saying it's bad, that the best breakthrough we can have for the future is a societal breakthrough. Which is,
what kind of breakthrough?
No, a societal breakthrough, something to do with us and society.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, just what everyone's been talking about, how, we have to think about freedom of speech, or freedom and responsibility, even in relation to COVID, but also, someone's mentioned the children, our relationship to children, how all these are more societal breakthroughs that we need to overcome, rather than scientific ones. And I just thought I'd point that out. I'll just go back to questions. There's so many questions. I'll go for whoever was first. I think it was Lloyd had his hand up first.
Hello, yes. In our group too, what we focused on was about how we get to a healthy society, a society that brings forth the capabilities of its members. And I think that's what most of the groups, to some extent or other, talked about, is it's about relationships, it's about wholeness. And certainly that was what David Bohm was looking at. And I would just like to say a couple of things about Darwin. I think he's getting a really bad rap here, because Darwin did not introduce the term survival of the fittest. That came from Herbert Spencer. And I've also, and after he wrote up the journals from the Beagle, the rest of his life was spent researching, showing how it is cooperation that has the most to do with the survival of species. And I read a book a few years ago, and I can't remember who the quote was from, but the interpretation, and this was someone with background in the field, the more accurate interpretation of the survival of the fittest, which is ascribed to Darwin, was in fact that those organisms and those species that most fit in their ecosystem have the highest rate of survival. So that's a very different form of fittest than we've been led to believe. So I will let it go at that. Thank you.
I wonder how many people who have read Origins of Species have read Descent of Man, because it's like they are two different books. I mean, extraordinary, written by two different people. And it's supporting the point that you just made. I was astonished. I read them in sequence, and I was astonished by the difference in attitude, theoretical frame, all of it, between those two books. And I'm curious about that in terms of Darwin's life. I won't find out about that. But I would reinforcing the point you just made, I would encourage everybody who has any interest in Darwin to read Descent of Man. It's a whole different dimension of reality and human relationship to life. It also seems to me that a hidden, by hidden, what do I mean? Invisible an invisible, unconscious dynamic on the topics that we're talking about. But in these discussions is the dynamic of dominion. Because we keep talking about what we do. We talk about freedom in terms of what we do. It seems, and our rights. And it seems to me that if COVID is teaching us anything, it is teaching us we don't have dominion. We do not have dominion. And dominion alone will really extinguish our species down the road. And we never have had dominion. That reality is forcing itself into awareness, into consciousness now. And we've gotten away with it since Descartes, that we have dominion. And ironically, I forget who mentioned Trump, but one of the manufacturers of the voting machines is Dominion. That's the name of the company. And those are the ones that Trump wanted removed so that he could have dominion.
Interesting.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment, Jerome. As we're approaching the end, maybe I'll take one or maybe two questions. Is that okay, Oliver, with you?
Fine.
Okay. I know Valgina's had her hand up for a while. Is that right? Oh, you're muted.
No, just a quick comment is that we've all read about the studies of the trees sending aid to one another in times of need. Well, there was a study I read this morning about mice who are on that sort of wheel going around, and they inject one of the mice with a very painful substance so that he's in pain and stressed, and the other mouse reacts. And it was very interesting. And then when they helped the other mouse out, the other one also felt relief. So obviously there's an immediate correspondence to the way we treat children and the way we treat each other.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to thank Oliver for such an interesting presentation, which has certainly spawned some extraordinary ramifications. And it's all related.
Thank you, Valjean. And finally, I'll just take the last question from Alan.
Thank you, James. It is a question, and it's a question about science, whether what is considered science, how it is done, where there could be a radical change in that. And I'm really thinking about, we have this reductionist approach to science, but it seems increasingly that it's fraying at the edges. We have Rupert Sheldrake in his book, The Science Delusion, which lists 10 assumptions that form the bedrock of science, which he challenges based on evidence. We have all these consciousness studies that seem to be sort of blurring how we do science. And there is also Dean Radin and the Noetic Institute, which is doing all these studies on paranormal activity, which he, I think, would argue the evidence is overwhelming, but they're not the kind of experiments that are sort of that are easily repeatable. And yet, nevertheless, he would argue, I'm sure, that the evidence for things science doesn't understand is overwhelming. So my question is could there be a breakthrough or radical change in just what we consider science and how it should be carried out?
I think that's the crucial question of the 21st century. And I forget how you phrased it, but even the phrase paranormal, we just assume that we know what is normal. And we do not take into question whether the boundaries of science need to be expanded to include the kinds of experiences that we have every day that are not considered valid for scientific study because they're not replicable. And so when you take something like synchronicity, for example, it's not replicable because by definition, there's no cause and effect. And the one of the assumptions is that defines science is that it has to be. And the narrowness of the scientific boundary is extremely, extremely problematical. And it gets us to deny our own experience as valid in scientific study. I am a psychologist, and I would also criticize psychology for having the same kind of narrowness, because it dismisses the whole mathematical and boundaried structure of science, because it doesn't take account of feelings and so forth. And I think I think it's time for both fields, long since time for both fields to turn around, look at each other and start talking to each other and discovering what the boundaries are within their respective domains.
Thank you.
Sorry, I muted myself there. Oliver, do you have anything to respond to Alan's questions or Jerome's comment?
Yeah, not exactly answering the questions because I just enjoyed the whole discussion, and I am very thankful to everybody because all the comments were very enlightening. But I would like to say just a few words relating to this discussion with the ideas of David Bohm. As you know, I have been working on David Bohm's work, life and works, as a historian of science, more in this capacity than somebody who read David Bohm's ideas to follow David Bohm's ideas. And then, so what I want to say, first of all, David Bohm was a great scientist, a great physicist, and at a certain moment of his life, he understood that science was not enough to the future of humankind on Earth. And he arrived to this conclusion that science was not enough, science maybe was not worth to be pursued, when he was in the middle, what I would say, of a crisis in science, a crisis in ideological convictions, because he had just left his Marxist views in the past, and he was looking for new ideas. Then I can say that David Bohm was a great scientist, but at least the mature David Bohm was not, he did not share the view of scientism. He had a clear view that science was not enough. The second comment is that boundaries of science are always movable. They are not established forever. And I just want to say one word. I know that, for instance, paranormal effects, we have a huge debate about this, if they are, if you may reproduce or not this phenomenon. But I will illustrate this kind of immovable boundary with a more simple example. When David Bohm wrote the Wholeness and Implicated Order in the early 80s, some of the readers, some of the commentators just said this was not science. Science could not be done without the Cartesian method. Some said that Bohm was just moving towards the mysticism and so on. Now, take the idea of wholeness, which was the title of his last book, The Undivided Universe. The idea of wholeness, at least in two of the examples we discussed today, the first, the Genome Human Project, who did not deliver their promise, and they just showed us that biological determinations are very far complex than we had thought early. And the current pandemic is showing us that this kind of strict deterministic, strict reductionism view are not enough. Then I think that some of the ideas David Bohm defended and wrote in the early 80s are well corroborated by the development of science and the development of society. Unfortunately, David Bohm was no longer with us to see this kind of discussion we are having this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that, Olival. Unfortunately, we do have to finish the session. We have gone a little bit over, so unfortunately, we'll close. Olival, do you have anything to say just to finish everything off?
No, just to thank everybody for the wonderful discussion we had in this session. And thank you very much to the organizer, to you and to Eleanor, for the organization of this wonderful meeting.
Well, thank you so much, Olival, for today, and thank you so much for your kind words. And thank you all for joining us. It's been a fantastic session. I found it. Before we all go, I'd just like to make a couple announcements of what's going to happen next for the Power Center. So our next big event is our next virtual conference entitled Synchronicity, Mind and Matter, which is a 4-week program starting on February 13th. And it will be 8 sessions, and it's got quite an amazing lineup, I find it. We have speakers such as Alan Coombs, Roderick Main, Cruz Magna Sabadini, Matthew Mather, Remo Roth, Shantena Sabadini, Yuri Cosato, and Jean-Francois Venzina. In this program, we will focus on synchronicity as a gate to a deeper understanding of the relationships between mind and matter, and as a guide to read the archetypal energy configurations we encounter in our daily life. This experiential approach to synchronicity will use the I Ching, the ancient Chinese oracle, as a tool to invite in synchronicity. And we will be using the I Ching in a workshop, which will be hosted during one of those weekends with Shantena and Cruz. And finally, we'd like to invite you to our second installation of our series, Flickering Reality, exploring ideas in film and television. This session, which will run on the 30th of January, will have guest speaker Chris Hawk, who will talk about horror and the role of terror, the antithesis of being glad to be alive. Chris will be looking at the film genre of horror, but looking at the imagery of the genre and looking at the relationship between terror and film and the sublime through a Jungian scope. So I really invite you to see this. We have many more events programmed, so please visit our website under the events page. As always, you can contact us via the website. We have a contact us section. Otherwise, you can email us directly at either james@powercenter.com to reach me, or Eleanor@powercenter.com to reach Eleanor. Thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you again soon here at the Parr Center. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, audience.